Imagine being stripped naked, whipped until your skin tore, and told it was for your own good. In Sparta, this wasn't a crime, it was daily life. This is the same society the world glorifies as the birthplace of fearless warriors, where every boy was raised to be a soldier and every girl was raised to produce them. But behind the legends of Leonidas and the 300 lies a darker truth, one of punishments so cruel, so unforgiving, that they forged obedience through pain and terror. The Spartans didn't just punish criminals. They punished children, women, warriors, and even kings. If you were weak, if you disobeyed, if you showed cowardice, the price wasn't just shame, it was suffering. Brutality wasn't a flaw of the system, it was the system. From the moment a Spartan baby drew breath, their worth was judged. Some were left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. Others endured years of ritualized starvation, beatings, and public humiliation in the notorious Agoge. Adults weren't spared either. Men could be flogged for cowardice, exiled for dishonor, or publicly disgraced in front of the same community they had once bled to protect. Even kings who defied the Spartan code could face imprisonment or death. And what's more shocking? These punishments weren't hidden in the shadows. They were often performed in public as lessons for everyone watching. Obey Sparta or suffer like this. Tonight, we're pulling back the bronze curtain to reveal the 7 most horrific punishments used by the Spartans. From the cruel training rituals of children to the merciless justice dealt to warriors and rulers, each one will make you ask, was this discipline, or was it sheer brutality disguised as honor? By the end of this story, you'll see why even Sparta's allies feared their brand of justice, and you'll be left wondering if you could have survived a single year under their iron rule. Spartan society was unlike anything else in the ancient world. From cradle to grave, every man, woman, and child was judged not as an individual but as a cog in the great war machine of the state. And punishment was the tool that kept that machine running smoothly. It began the moment a child was born. When most of Greece celebrated new life with family gatherings, the Spartans practiced a ritual far more chilling. Newborns were inspected by state officials, their tiny bodies scrutinized for signs of weakness or deformity. A baby who appeared strong was allowed to live. But a baby judged unfit? They were carried to the jagged cliffs of Mount Taygetus and left to die, exposed to the elements, the cries fading into silence. To the Spartans this was not cruelty. It was necessity. Better to kill weakness at its root than to allow it to infect the future army. Those who survived this first judgment entered the infamous Agoge, a state-run system that raised boys into warriors. And the Agoge was built on pain. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were torn from their families and placed in barracks, where punishment was not the exception but the very method of teaching. Food was scarce by design. Children were deliberately starved, forced to steal just to survive. But here's the catch. If they were caught stealing, they weren't punished for the theft, they were punished for being clumsy enough to get caught. Whippings, beatings, and humiliation followed, driving home a brutal lesson. Skill and cunning were valued above comfort, and pain was the price of weakness. And if starvation and beatings weren't enough, Spartan children also endured ritualized torture in the name of religion. The most infamous example was the flagellation contests held at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. In front of cheering crowds, boys were whipped across their backs until the ground ran red. Some endured the lash in silence, refusing to cry out, because to do so was to disgrace yourself before the gods and your community. Others collapsed, and some even died, beaten to death under the watchful gaze of priests and citizens. Imagine that for a moment. Parents watching their sons bleed in public, not with horror but with pride. This was the Spartan way. These punishments weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated lessons. Endurance meant survival. Silence under torture meant honor. To cry out was weakness, and weakness could not be tolerated. By the time a Spartan boy reached his teenage years, he had already endured more pain than most adults in the ancient world would face in a lifetime. And yet, in this twisted system, these punishments produced warriors capable of withstanding unimaginable hardship. The Spartans believed that by breaking their children early, they would build men who could never be broken on the battlefield. But what does that say about a society that valued its children not as lives to be cherished, but as weapons to be forged? If this is what they did to children, imagine what awaited adults who broke the rules. If a Spartan child survived the ritual of the Agoge's first years, his life only became harsher. The punishments he faced weren't simply punishments in the way we think of them today. They were daily rituals of discipline, woven into every lesson, every game, every meal, or rather, every lack of a meal. Starvation was not an accident of poor supply. It was policy. The boys were given just enough food to stay alive but never enough to feel full. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, pushing them toward theft. But in Sparta, theft was not truly condemned, it was part of the training. A boy who could steal food without being caught was praised for his cunning. A boy who was caught, however, was beaten savagely. And the punishment had nothing to do with morality. It was about competence. To be careless, to be clumsy, to fail at deception, this was unforgivable. Beatings were a constant companion. Elders struck the boys for infractions, for mistakes, sometimes for no reason at all except to harden them. But what may sound even stranger is that peers too were permitted, sometimes encouraged, to enforce punishment. Older boys whipped younger ones. A child who faltered in exercises, who lagged behind in drills, would be beaten not just by his instructors, but by those he called comrades. Pain was shared and multiplied so that obedience was enforced not only by fear of the lash, but by fear of betraying your fellow Spartans. Then came the humiliations. Discipline was not always blood and bruises. Sometimes it was shame. A boy who misbehaved might be ordered to sing a song before his peers, his voice cracking, his humiliation etched into memory. Others were made to dance, their awkwardness exposed for ridicule. These rituals might seem mild compared to the lash, but in Sparta, disgrace could cut deeper than any whip. Plutarch, the ancient historian, tells us stories that still chill the imagination. Boys endured whippings so severe that their flesh was torn open, yet they stood in silence, refusing to cry out. To scream was weakness. To show pain was dishonor. Some died beneath the blows, but the survivors were celebrated. Imagine a child so conditioned by fear, so trapped by the gaze of his peers, that even as his body gave way, he chose silence over survival. The psychological punishment was as brutal as the physical. Every boy knew that his worth was measured by his endurance, his obedience, his ability to suffer without protest. From morning drills to nightly inspections, punishment wasn't just a consequence, it was the backbone of education. To live as a Spartan boy was to live under constant trial, each day a test of whether you were worthy to become a man. And yet, it worked. If by worked, we mean it forged soldiers of almost unmatched resilience. By the time these boys became men, they had been starved, beaten, humiliated, and bloodied so often that hardship became their natural state. Pain was not an enemy. Pain was a teacher. But punishments didn't end at training. Spartans carried them into adulthood and the battlefield. Imagine living your entire adult life under the shadow of shame worse than death. That's the discipline that made Sparta unstoppable. And right now you have a choice. Subscribe to the History Scar and carry these stories with you, or don't, and leave a scar of your own in the comments telling us why you're turning away. The Spartan boy who endured the agoge emerged as a warrior, but his life did not suddenly become easier. If anything, the punishments grew harsher because now the stakes were higher. As a soldier of Sparta, every action on the battlefield was judged not only as a matter of survival, but as a reflection of the entire state. The glory of Sparta could not be stained by cowardice, hesitation, or failure. For an adult warrior, the rules of punishment were simple and merciless. To lose your spear or sword in battle was unfortunate. To lose your helmet was careless. But to lose your shield? That was unforgivable. The shield was not merely personal protection. It was what held the phalanx together, the wall of bronze that made Spartan armies invincible. A man who abandoned his shield was not just risking his life. He was risking the lives of everyone standing beside him. Such an act branded him a coward. And cowardice in Sparta was worse than death. The punishment was not always a blade across the throat. Instead, the Spartans wielded something even more terrifying, the loss of honor. A man declared a coward was stripped of his citizenship. In an instant he ceased to be a full member of society. He could no longer join the communal meals, the syssitia, that defined Spartan brotherhood. Imagine standing outside the great dining hall, hearing the laughter and camaraderie of your peers, knowing you were banned from ever entering again. The humiliation didn't stop there. Cowards were forced to wear cloaks dyed with disgrace, often of a color associated with shame rather than valor. Their beards, symbols of adulthood, were mutilated, sometimes shaved half away so that every person who saw them knew what they were. The punishment followed them everywhere. No woman would marry them. No man would sit beside them. Children mocked them in the streets. They lived as outcasts in their own homeland, a living reminder of what it meant to fail Sparta. Some, unable to endure the shame, chose exile. Others faded into obscurity. And for those who committed repeated acts of cowardice or desertion, death could still be the final punishment. Sparta could forgive injury, but it could never forgive dishonor. Yet even as these punishments crushed individuals, they served a greater purpose. They bound the army together through fear. Every man knew that to falter was to be destroyed, not just physically but socially. The threat of punishment was a weapon as sharp as any spear. And it worked. Spartan warriors became legends, men who stood their ground against impossible odds, not only because of pride, but because the shame of retreat was worse than the certainty of death. This system of discipline produced the most disciplined military machine the ancient world had ever seen. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held back an army of thousands, and their defiance became immortal. But behind that defiance was a lifetime of punishment. Punishment that had taught them that their lives were not their own, that failure was unthinkable, that death was preferable to disgrace. It is easy to admire the discipline of Sparta from a distance. The sight of soldiers who never broke ranks, who never fled, is awe-inspiring. But we must remember that this discipline was not born from freedom or choice or inspiration. It was born from terror. Terror of humiliation. Terror of exile. Terror of the merciless punishments that awaited anyone who failed their city. The Spartans were feared by their enemies, yes. But perhaps they were even more feared by their own. Yet not even high-ranking leaders or kings were safe from Spartan justice. Discipline in Sparta was not confined to the battlefield. It reached into every household, every street, every citizen's life. To live as a Spartan meant constant vigilance, for even the smallest failures in civic duty could invite punishment. For the ordinary citizen, neglecting the responsibilities of the state was treated with the same severity as failing in war. A man who skipped the communal meals, the syssitia, without good reason could be fined or shamed publicly. These meals were more than food, they were a bond that tied citizens together. To neglect them was to turn your back on Sparta itself. Others who shirked their duties, whether in training, in assembly, or in maintaining their role as warriors, risked fines, loss of rights, or humiliating censure. A Spartan citizen was expected to live not for himself, but for the state, and the state punished any who failed that trust. Spartan women held a unique place in Greece. They were freer than their Athenian counterparts, allowed to own property, speak in public, and even train their bodies. But this freedom came with a heavy cost. Their duty was simple: to produce strong children for Sparta. A woman who failed in this role, who was accused of adultery or dishonoring her household, faced harsh punishment. In some cases her head was shaved, her body humiliated in public. Others were forced into disgraceful marriages meant to correct their failure, their lives reduced to examples for the community. The Spartan woman carried the burden of honor not only for herself, but for the lineage of the state. And even kings were not beyond the reach of Spartan justice. Unlike other Greek states where rulers reigned with near impunity, Sparta's kings were bound by law, and the law could turn against them. A king who misused his power could be fined, imprisoned, even exiled. The most famous case was that of King Pausanias. Once celebrated as a hero of the Persian Wars, he was later accused of treason, conspiring with the enemy. He fled into a temple, seeking sanctuary, but the ephors, the Spartan magistrates, walled him in. Trapped inside, cut off from food and water, Pausanias slowly starved to death on holy ground, his body a chilling reminder that even a king was not immune to the punishments of Sparta. In this way, Spartan justice was both merciless and indiscriminate. From the lowest citizen to the highest ruler, no one was safe. Punishments were the great equalizer, ensuring that all bowed before the iron will of the state. But some punishments went beyond justice. They were ritualized cruelty, almost entertainment. The Spartans didn't just punish, they turned suffering into a show for all to see. And that's what we do at the History Scar: expose the scars the past tried to hide. So, if you're still watching and haven't subscribed, why? Either click that button now, or walk into the comments and confess why you'd rather turn your back on history. In Sparta, punishment was never just about correcting behavior. It was about performance. Ritualized acts of cruelty staged for all to see, meant to burn fear and obedience into the hearts of both citizens and slaves. These punishments were public lessons, a constant reminder that discipline was the lifeblood of the Spartan state. One of the most infamous examples was the ritual flogging at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. During festivals, Spartan boys were paraded before the altar and whipped until their backs split open. Crowds gathered, not to stop the violence but to cheer it on. Parents watched with pride as their children endured agony in silence, for to cry out was disgrace. Some boys collapsed, blood pooling at their feet. Others died, sacrificed not to the gods but to the brutal ideals of their society. To Sparta this was not barbarity. It was virtue. The pain of the few was a lesson to the many, endurance was the path to honor. But perhaps the most chilling ritual of all was the cryptiae. Often described as a form of secret police, it was in reality a yearly purge disguised as training. Young Spartans were sent into the countryside armed with daggers, ordered to stalk the Helots, the enslaved population who outnumbered the Spartans many times over. Their task was simple: kill without mercy, kill without being caught. The cryptiae served two purposes. It taught young warriors stealth, cunning, and ruthlessness. And it kept the Helots in a state of constant terror, never knowing when the knife might come in the night. This was punishment on a societal scale. The Helots were not guilty of crimes. Their only crime was existing in a state of servitude. By sanctioning their murder, Sparta reminded them daily of their powerlessness. Every Spartan child grew up knowing that cruelty was not only accepted but expected. Every Helot lived with the knowledge that resistance was suicide. The psychological impact was profound. Citizens obeyed because disobedience was unthinkable. Helots labored because fear was stronger than hope. And all the while, the rituals of punishment, whether in the temple or in the fields, reinforced the unshakable supremacy of Sparta. So, what made Spartan punishments unique wasn't just their brutality, it was that they were embedded into every level of life. From the moment a Spartan child drew its first breath, to the day a warrior laid down his shield for the last time, punishment was the thread that stitched their society together. Infants judged unworthy were abandoned on the mountainside. Children were starved, beaten, and humiliated in the agoge. Adults lived under the constant threat of exile, disgrace, or even death. Kings themselves were not above the law, sometimes starved within the walls of a temple. And through ritualized cruelty, whether the floggings at Artemis Orthia or the blood-soaked cryptiae, Sparta turned punishment into a performance that shaped every layer of life. It is no wonder the Spartans were admired for their strength. They forged men who stood unflinching in the face of death, who held their ground against impossible odds. But admiration came at a cost. For behind the legend of Sparta's bravery lay a society built on fear. They were feared by their enemies for their discipline, but feared by their own people for their cruelty. And that raises the question, would you survive in Sparta? Could you endure the lash, the hunger, the humiliation, the ever-present threat of disgrace? Would you last even a single year in a world where pain was a teacher, where punishment was a way of life? Or would these punishments break you as they broke so many before? And if such methods returned today, if our lives were ruled by fear and ritual suffering, how long would you last? Tell me what you think. Comment below which punishment shocked you the most, and whether you believe you could endure the Spartan way of life. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more brutal history that makes you say, wait, what?